Thank you very much for this kind invitation. And because we don't really know what kind of audience we would have, so I prepared this paper as if you don't know anything about the idea of a self in Sufi or Zen tradition. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Al-Ghazali's one, but probably not Dogen's ones. But I have to go through Al-Ghazali's one just to highlight some key things. So after setting the scene, I will discuss the idea of the self in Sufism and then focusing on the works of Al-Ghazali and Dogen. And after the concluding remarks, I'm very happy to hear your thoughts and comments as well. So despite the geographical and cultural distance, Sufism and Zen share a number of teachings and practices. So Sufism, as many of you know, seek direct encounter with the divine, not only intellectual understanding of the text. And Zen also must be lived. Among various sects in Buddhism, the Zen worldview centrally concerns living experience of enlightenment. So both Sufi and Zen practices aim for spiritual awareness, which is usually gained through external and internal exercises such as dhikr, remembrance of God, like a meditation, as well as living properly every single moment. So both Sufism and Zen have a long history of group activities like the Sufi orders or Zen monasteries, and with strong mentorship. So sheikh, or in terms of Zen, like Roshi or shike, the master, the teacher. But awareness itself is individual experience. So the importance of such personal experience inevitably makes practitioners focus on seemingly the most personal entity, the self. So in Sufism, in order to attain like altered state of consciousness where first-hand communion with the divine is considered to take place, the lower self or soul, nafs, has to be annihilated. And there have been, the nafs has been translated in different ways, but considering the comparative aspect of this talk, I'm just saying self, but that means the nafs in Arabic. So the nafs, or the self, is the major obstacle to gain full realization of the divine reality, and has to be disciplined, as in the title of Al-Ghazali's book on the nafs, disciplining the self. So a similar idea seems to appear in Zen teaching, as in one of the most quoted statements of a Zen master, Dōgen: to learn the self, to learn the way of Buddha is to learn the self. To learn the self is to forget the self. So in this talk, I would like to compare the idea of the self in Sufism and Zen, focusing on the major writings of the two influential figures in the respective traditions. So Ihya Ulūm-ad-Dīn of Al-Ghazali and Shobo Genzo, the treasury of the true Dharma eye of Dōgen. So Al-Ghazali, as all of us know, a theologian, jurist, mystic, is one of the most influential Muslim thinkers. And Dōgen is the founder of the Soto Zen school, one of the largest Zen schools in Japan, and wrote Shobo Genzo over a period of 20 years. So unlike Al-Ghazali, he died before seeing its completion, so it is actually unfinished. But it has been studied within and outside his Zen school, and his writings have been quoted widely. And in terms of comparative analysis, a number of works have been conducted comparing the thought of Al-Ghazali and Dōgen with that of mostly Christian theologians and European philosophers. Since the medieval time, Al-Ghazali has been known not only among Muslims, but also in the Latin world with his Latin name Al-Ghazal. So outside Muslim thinkers, Al-Ghazali has been compared mainly with philosophers, including Jewish and Christian theologians, most notably Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas, and also Descartes. And others include, for example, Judah Halevi, Maimonides, Eckhart, and Kant, Schopenhauer, Freud, and so on. And the list is not exhaustive at all. Actually, there are a lot more. And as for Dōgen scholarship, his teachings were kept within the Soto Zen school until a well-known Japanese philosopher, Watsuji, published Shaman Dōgen in 1926, which prompted studies of Dōgen among Japanese intellectuals. So outside Japan, comprehensive studies of Dōgen began in 1970s when translations of his work and scholarly analysis of his thoughts started to appear in English. So in terms of cross-traditional analysis, like Al-Ghazālī, Dōgen has also been compared with Aquinas, Eckhart, and Descartes. And Dōgen has been mainly compared with German and Jewish philosophers and Christian theologians, most notably Heidegger. There's tons of work comparing Heidegger and Dōgen. And others include, for example, Böhme, Spinoza, Wittgenstein, Buber, Derrida, and also Michael Ende, a novelist. So neither of those lists is exhaustive, but they indicate that the amount of comparative study is indeed large, especially for Dōgen, considering that he was kind of discovered in the English-speaking world rather recently. So the previous comparative works include theologians, mystics, and philosophers. And first, maybe we can think about whether Al-Ghazali and Dōgen can be categorized as mystics. And Al-Ghazali, yes, he was a theologian, as we know, and after his spiritual crisis or midlife crisis, he famously advocated the Sufi way of life, and he left Baghdad and wandered around in a Sufi cloak. So it makes more sense to characterize some of his thought as mystical compared to Dōgen's or Zen and Buddhism in general, if mysticism is only about the experience of unification with the divine. Because in Buddhism, there is no divine, there is no God, there is no theological issue there. And this issue will touch upon the fundamental question of what constitutes the mystical, which is probably beyond the scope of this talk. But probably it's enough to say here that depending on the definition of mysticism, Zen actually has been considered by many scholars like a deeply mystical, more mystical than either Christianity or even Islam. And as for philosophy, so I'm very happy to hear actually what you think about Dōgen's thoughts after this talk. And as for philosophy, those lists indicate that although neither Al-Ghazali nor Dōgen would have described himself as a philosopher, philosophical elements of their thoughts have been recognized. So Al-Ghazali, as we know, famously refuted philosophy, and especially like Ibn Sina and Avicenna and Al-Farabi, and in his Tahafuz al-Falasifa. And according to him, Al-Ghazali studied philosophy deeply in order to refute it. But the relationship of Al-Ghazali with philosophy has been debated for centuries. And some scholars actually claim that maybe he wasn't that enemy of philosophy, or maybe he was actually seduced into it despite himself. So this is kind of a debatable point. But he wouldn't have described himself as a philosopher. But as for Dōgen, the term philosophy or tetsugaku didn't exist in Japan until the 19th century. And Japan used to close its door to foreign countries. But in mid-19th century, it was forced to open. And then from the latter half of the 19th century, the new concepts and technologies, logic and philosophical discourse flooded into Japan from Western societies. So in order to represent these new terms and concepts, many words were coined over a period of time, and philosophy was one of them. So the others include like a religion and also reason or society, freedom, rights or individual or love, beauty, art. So these are all newly coined words in the latter half of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. But does this mean that philosophical thought didn't exist in Japan until then, or did love or beauty or art not exist in Japan until the end of the 19th century? So probably it wasn't the case. But it is clear that Dōgen, who died in 1253, wouldn't have used the term philosophy or categorized his thoughts in that category. But having said that all, when I teach about Dōgen, Zen, and especially Dōgen or Zen rather than Al-Ghazali, my students usually think that Zen or his thought is very, very philosophical rather than religious. So this issue again touches on the fundamental question of what makes philosophy philosophical. So after my paper, I would be very happy to hear your thought as well. So let's move on the self. So the usual Arabic term for the self is, of course, as you know, nafs. And nafs has been rendered soul or spirit or mind, individual desire, identity, and self or lower self. And the term appears nearly 300 times in the Quran, both singular and plural. And the meanings of nafs and its plural forms vary in the Quran, but sometimes as this Quranic verse represents man's very self, and nafs incite him to evil. In some of the verses using the nafs is related to kind of negative, like earthbound entity. And of course, in Sufism, they follow this negative earthbound entity that needs to be constantly watched over and controlled. And at the beginning of the book, Disciplining the Self, Improving the Character and Treating the Diseases of the Heart, Al-Ghazali quotes a Quranic verse, "The one who purifies oneself succeeds, and the one who corrupts it fails." Because, according to him, the foundation of Islam is the excellence of character. So this basically means that, the consequence of having evil character is hell. So Al-Ghazali warns that fasting or praying all day or night is not enough, actually. That wouldn't ensure a path to heaven. So having purified self, good character is much more important, according to this book, than superficial worship. And it is each individual's responsibility to improve moral character because, according to the Quran, God made human in an excellent shape. And in addition, the Prophet Muhammad was sent to refine the excellent qualities of character. So evil character, according to Al-Ghazali, comes from the diseases of hearts and illnesses of selves, which are beyond the usual corporeal treatment by physicians. So it is crucial for each individual to make a constant effort, jihad, to improve the character, because according to this book, the consequence of having ill character is much severer than the consequence of having ill health, which only leads to vanishment of the corporeal and transient life. But the consequence of having bad character is living in hell, very long time, if not eternally. And Al-Ghazali also gives some recommendation how to improve the character. He repeatedly emphasizes the importance of constant endeavor, mujahada, and riyada of the self. So first of all, it is important to notice that the fault of the self, when according to Al-Ghazali, the majority of people are ignorant of their own weaknesses. So he lists 4 ways to find these hidden faults of the nafs. So from a good sheikh, but he said that it is really rare to find such an insightful person. And from a good friend, again, it is difficult to find a true friend. And from enemies who can see our defect much better than ourselves, but it is actually difficult to, or not easy to believe our enemies' words. So again, it is difficult. And then from being surrounded by people whose faults mirror our own. Although this requires a high level of self-discipline. So as high as the level of a prophet like Jesus, who avoided the defects he saw in others. So as can be seen, each path comes with its own difficulty. So Al-Ghazali recommends that if one finds a good teacher or sheikh, just stick to them. Just never let them go and just always just follow them. So while examining the self, action needs to be right too. So, for example, those who would like to be generous or modest persistently need to act with generosity or imitate the behavior of modest people by striving against the self until these actions and qualities become delightful and part of their nature. And determination and persistence are the key because self-discipline is like taming animals. So it takes time and effort. And Al-Ghazali confirmed that this jihad lasts until the time of death. So constant discipline is necessary because following the Quranic description and early Sufi tradition, for Al-Ghazali, the self is the enemy and it must be fought against. So a war has to be declared. So this idea is summed up in this really famous hadith, of course, lesser and greater jihad. So the greater jihad is the jihad against nafs. But once tamed, the disciplined nafs or purified self will make one superior to animals because they manage to conquer their animal soul. So the idea of jihad against the self may give an impression that this battle occurs only internally. But throughout Al-Ghazali's book and in Sufism in general, as we know, a close link between internal and external, heart and body, and personal and social is emphasized. So according to Al-Ghazali, if the self is good, so is the external or social behavior. And he leads the exemplary conduct of those who have good character. For example, keeping a cheerful facial expression, being close to people, and pleasing people without causing harm. So for him, self-discipline seems to be a social project. So according to Al-Ghazali and other Sufi authors, nafs is a component of human nature, which can be and also has to be transformed through internal and external effort and discipline and ultimately divine grace. So mystical disciplines, including remembrance and repentance, are designed to transform the self in order to prepare it for a transcendental encounter with the absolute reality, God. This is kind of a reminder or just highlighting the key aspect of the book and Al-Ghazali thought. So let's move on to the self in Zen. So these Sufi virtues have a strong echo in Japanese Zen, although historically and doctrinally, Islam and Buddhism do not appear to have much in common. So originally from southern India, Zen is a form of Buddhism, which developed in China and was introduced to Japan in the 7th century, a century after the arrival of Buddhism in Japan. So among various traditions, Zen exemplifies the code of ideal behavior in Japan. And the essential teaching of Zen is the same as that of Mahayana Buddhism. But Zen directly focuses on the spirit of Buddha in order to awaken transcendental wisdom, Hanya, or in Sanskrit, prajna. So once it is achieved, we can see the reality of things beyond their phenomenal manifestations and become truly compassionate with all beings, including inanimate things. We come back to this point later on. So Zen refuses to follow intellect and logic unconditionally, and sometimes requires reversing the ordinary way of understanding in order to attain penetrating knowledge, Hanya. So Zen is the whole mind based on individual living experiences. So it points the way to awaken the true knowledge of who we really are from the state of ignorance. So unlike Islam and some other religions, Buddhism doesn't hold the creation theory. But this shouldn't be regarded that Buddhist teachings are fundamentally against the existence of one and only God. Rather, as the famous Japanese scholar of Islam, Suzuki, I'm sure many of you know, explains, his father was a Zen practitioner, so he wrote this very famous book on Zen. Actually, it's a really good one. And he said that the primary concern of Buddhism is human in our current form. So rather than how or why human beings came to exist, then just focusing on just us now in the current form. So this worldview is strengthened in Zen. So which directly begins to ask, who am I? Instead of what is humankind or how humankind came to being. So one of the essential problems in Zen, therefore, concerns the most personal and individual entity, self, but not simply the self, but non-self. The perception of non-self is a central teaching in Buddhism. So Zen cosmology holds that every entity, from the universe, nature, to insects and objects like this table, is one. And this inseparable whole begins with our own self. So all the phenomena are related, and the full realization of being part of this one total whole is the stage of enlightenment in Zen. So self-examination is the key in Zen teaching, as seen in Dōgen's really oft-quoted statement, to learn the way of Buddha is to learn the self. A tiny being or temporal manifestation reflects the whole universe and vice versa. So nothing separates ourselves from others, and both ourselves and others, part and whole, are this organic, inseparable existence. And Dogen's statement continues, to learn the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be evidence in all dharmas. To be evidence in all dharmas is to set the body and mind of the self and the bodies and minds of others. So Dogen describes the time when he understood the real Buddha Dharma or reached enlightenment after spending long time for seated meditation, that he shed off body and mind and cut off polluted knowledge and thought which had been jumbled up in the past. So this is the time when he had full realization of the Buddha work performed by every single entity, including land, plants, trees, walls, tiles, and stones. So what does this famous Buddhist perception of non-self mean? And what does Dogen mean when he says to forget oneself and shedding off body and mind? So the terms anatta or anatta have been translated into English as non-self, no self, not self, selflessness, non-ego, egoless, and so on. And in Japanese, it's called muga. So mu means nothing and ga is self or ego. So although anatta and its Chinese translation includes a prefix or ideogram which negates following word the self, this doctrine shouldn't be understood based on the grammatical point of view. So Buddhism teaches mutual causality and interdependency, and achievement of the state of like sunyata, like sometimes translated as nothingness or emptiness, is to get over the dichotomy in perception, so including the self and non-self, life and death, and good and evil. So once full realization of this relative interconnectivity is achieved, and the false dichotomous view is passed through, attachment will disappear and lost mind can fully function in order to achieve enlightenment. So enlightenment is to embrace the nature of interdependence and unsustainability of all phenomena. But it's quite a complicated one. So for clarification, I really like to quote Izutsu's example. He says, suppose someone asks me, who are you? Or what are you? To this question, I can give an almost infinite number of answers. I can say, for example, I'm a student, I'm a lecturer, I'm so-and-so, and giving my name. None of these answers, however, present the whole of myself in its absolute suchness. And no matter how many times I may repeat the formula, I am X, I shall never be able to present directly and immediately the whole man that I am. So all that is presented by this formula is nothing but a partial and relative aspect of my existence, an objectified codification of the whole man. But the concern of Zen is precisely this whole man. So the doctrine of anatta is not to deny or lose or remove the self, but rather help understand it as its totality. So according to Zen, ordinary people like me see things as if they were in a dream. So for example, I see a flower or plant in the garden, but I'm not actually looking at it as it really is. So in order to see the reality of things, like waking up from a dream, so total self-transformation is necessary. So in Zen, so self-transformation is based on full recognition of being part of this total whole. So Zen cosmology actually denies any duality or dichotomy. So under normal circumstances, we perceive a flower as an object, with the observer, myself, with the subject. So I'm looking at the flower. So there are two different things. But the Zen consciousness does not see a flower as a distinguished or distinguishable object from the subject. So this is a kind of absolute unity, which is neither subjective or objective, but which is at the same time both subjective and objective. This is where things get rather complicated, and my students often give up. Dōgen said, an ancient Buddha said, mountains are mountains, waters are waters. These words do not mean mountains are mountains. They mean mountains are mountains. So this is a very typical Dōgen, the Buddhist or Zen rhetoric. So there is a 3-step demonstration. So affirmative, negative, and affirmative. So a typical Buddhist perspective. So first, there's a discrimination. So at the beginning, discriminatory observation is functional. So it is important to observe the different aspects of all things because it is necessary to notice the difference between awakening and delusion, or between those who are awakened and those who are not. So first, mountains are mountains, waters are waters. That's the first stage. And then denial of discrimination. So when one observes the tremendous difference between awakening and delusion and seeks awakening, one suddenly realizes that there is no delusion, there is no awakening. So when we are completely detached ourselves, we find ourselves and realize what is common to ourselves and others. So this is the point when the self opens into selflessness. So non-self is not an assertion that nothing exists. Rather, it is awareness of the interdependence of all things. So the reality of things as they are. So the second line, so these words do not mean mountains are mountains, means Dōgen denies this conventional dualistic understanding of mountains or subject-object division. And then we should then go beyond that and see the mountains as they really are. So that's the third final beyond discrimination and denial of it. So this is the state of full recognition of non-duality. So there's affirmative statement and negation of the affirmative and negation of the negative, so which is the positive, very positive statement. So when there is no self, so nothing recognizes a thing as the object, or the object no longer exists as an object, because the subject-object division is no longer present. So in this Zen consciousness, nothing is self-sufficient or self-existent. But this doesn't mean that an individual being ceases to exist. Individuals do exist concretely, and yet being at the same time so many actualization of the limitless, aspectless aspect of an ever-active, ever-creative act. That according to Izutsu, and I'm still trying to digest this one. So if you have any enlightening understanding, please let me know. So as you can see, Zen has its own peculiar experience of reality, which may seem to be different from the empirical reality, but Zen doesn't transcend the empirical dimension of reality. So the world of Zen, at its ultimate stage, is a world of sensation and perception, because the ordinary way, that precisely is the way. So Zen is not concerned with transcendence, unlike Sufism, which tries to unite with a transcendental entity, God. And this can be seen in one of Dōgen's famous poems, or tanga, entitled Innate State. So in the spring, cherry blossoms. In the summer, the kako. In autumn, the moon. In winter, the snow, clear, cold. So it looks like, this poem states something very obvious, just a beauty of season. But it's not only about beauty of the four seasons. So he states something obvious, but full realization of the innate form of every being, like the title of the poem, is the key in Zen consciousness. So Zen seeks ordinariness and everydayness. So the difference lies in the level of perception. So the everyday is the way. So there are lots of similarities and fundamental differences, as you may have seen. So in both Sufi and Zen traditions, freeing from the self or illusion is a shared concern. So both Al-Ghazālī and Dōgen talk about the intimate link between the internal and the external, the self and the social, mind and body. So the investigation of the self is not a socially isolated activity. One's own private conduct is connected with social behavior. On this point, I think the two authors provide us quite similar arguments. But in terms of the status of the self, they differ. So for Al-Ghazālī, the lower self, the nafs, is an enemy. The greater jihad is called against it. But in Dogen's work, the self is not described as an enemy. So attachment to the self, or indeed to anything, is discouraged in Buddhism in general, but the perception of the self is not as negative as in Sufism. This difference probably comes from a fundamental difference in the cosmic order that is the basis of their understanding of the respective belief system and their views of the self. So Islam, as in the line of the monotheist tradition, God is one. He is the creator, he is judge. So according to Al-Ghazali, God is the only perfect existence and absolute reality, and the full realization of God eventually leads to the full annihilation of the lower self. But Buddhism isn't based on the creation theory, and Dogen's world allows no such differentiation. So his worldview is clearly seen in his description of the time when he understood the real Buddha Dharma after spending a long time in Zazen, in the seated meditation. So at this moment, he had full realization of the Buddha work performed by every entity, including land, plants, trees, fences and walls, roof tiles and stones. So for Dogen, any superficial difference between sentient and non-sentient beings or among any phenomena and manifestations is irrelevant. His world contains no sense of hierarchy. So the self is for him to be learned and forgotten in order to free us from the illusion of duality and realize the interdependent nature of all phenomena. So this fundamental difference in their worldviews actually leads to something similar too. So for example, moral and ethics. So Al-Ghazali's view may seem to be rather hierarchy. God is clearly the highest. But in his ethics, it is essential to know one's own position in creation. So in his cosmology, in Islamic cosmology, recognition of the existence of the absolute is the source of modesty and morality. So in front of this absolute entity, reality, humans need to be thankful and respectful and modest and humble and so on. But as for Zen aims to awaken transcendental wisdom that help us to go beyond a relative perspective and to see the reality of things, including the self. And this should make one truly compassionate with everything because everything is connected. Nothing is lower or higher. There is no duality. So in the Zen consciousness, nothing is self-sufficient or self-existence. So everything is interdependent. So in such a world, every being and thing would be compassionate with each other because there is no each other in a real sense because there is nothing to separate us. And I should now go back to the title of this talk, to discipline or to forget. So the two phrases. So disciplining the nafs in Al-Ghazali's work and forgetting the self in Dogen's work seem to aim in a similar direction. So for Al-Ghazālī, self-discipline or self-transformation is the means to annihilate the nafs, but it is not an end in itself. The freeing oneself from the delusion of this world is important in order to gain experiential knowledge. On the other hand, according to Dōgen, learning and forgetting the self is not the means either, because for him, practice and enlightenment are the same. So there is no duality either there. And ultimately, the self doesn't need to be changed, because once its perception is cast away, the discussion of its very existence, let alone its transformation, would be irrelevant, because there is no self. So universal compassion is then possible in such a state, which is not a focus in Al-Ghazali's work. So Dōgen's transcendental wisdom is to see beyond to the reality of phenomenal existence, while Al-Ghazali attempts to see beyond to the divine reality. So there are many more similarities and differences, and you're more than welcome to read my article. But the final point about is the need for faith and the limitation of the intellect in both Al-Ghazali's and Dōgen's thought. So when we looked at the list of comparative analysis, you notice that there are perhaps more philosophers than theologians or mystics. But I would like to emphasize the importance of faith in both figures. So according to Al-Ghazali, Islam is about faith, and faith in prophets is the acknowledgement of a state beyond reason. So in his autobiographical work, Al-Munkit min ad-Dalal, he compares two tools of comprehension, the senses and the intellect, and highlights the importance of intellectual knowledge, which is higher than the senses, according to him. But faith is different. So one needs to open another eye, which is even above intellect. So in order to see the truth of the original nature. So according to Al-Ghazali, faith is beyond study or theoretical understanding, and it can be attained through direct experience rather than intellectual understanding. So Dōgen's thought is also based on firm belief in the Buddhas, as can be seen in his not dissimilar claim that the sphere of Buddhas is indeed inconceivable, beyond the reach of the work of mind and intellect. So he quotes an old saying about the need to take one further step at the top of 100-foot pole. So if you are on top of the 100-foot pole, it is clearly rational to hold tightly onto the pole once one reaches the top. But according to Dōgen, one in fact needs to keep on going, regardless of the possibility or definitely of falling down, and throw oneself into the Buddha Dharma. This requires a firm belief and faith in the teaching, and this faith is beyond intellectual understanding. So on the whole, the juxtaposition of the two masterpieces reveals striking similarities as well as fundamental differences at both doctrinal and practical levels. So without denying the philosophical depth of the thought of Al-Ghazali and Dōgen, I think this comparison highlights the importance of faith in both writings. I have published an article on this particular topic, but I'm pursuing Sufi Zen comparison or comparative analysis, so any feedback is welcome. Thank you very much.